Forget prefab ferns and cookie-cutter forests. In this final chapter, we unleash the true power of the Foliage Tool and forge landscapes that bleed individuality. We'll shatter the limitations of Fortnite fauna and delve into the arcane depths of advanced features and techniques. This is where Fortnite maps transcend mere greenery, evolving into ecosystems as unique and intricate as your wildest dreams. To show off the true power of the Foliage Tools, we'll use our Crimson Shrine of Suijin map, a map inspired by Call of Duty's Face Off and gunfight game types. With every element custom-built from scratch, the Crimson Shrine of Suijin is a small compact map designed for 4-player free-for-all matches, or 2 vs 2 team deathmatch, that ensures an adrenaline-pumping non-stop action experience that demands quick reflexes and strategic thinking. Full of destructible elements, choke points, and flanking routes, you'll need to master the map's layout, exploit its unique features, and unleash your inner warrior to claim victory in this captivating battleground. In our last 3 videos, we went through the basics of Foliage Mode, how to import and set up custom assets, and all the advanced settings and features. So in this video, we'll give you all the tips, tricks, and techniques for creating AAA quality visuals with foliage for your map. But before we descend into this botanical abyss, a reminder, for those lost in the wilderness of basic Foliage Mode, any of its settings, or still wrestling with importing custom assets, revisit the previous videos in this series, then return, sharpened and prepared, to unleash the true potential of Fortnite's flora. A key trick we use whenever painting foliage is always adjusting the density and radius painting settings before we begin painting. This will allow you to quickly paint large amounts of foliage without them being too densely placed. By also adjusting the min and max scale, the end result appears much more organic due to the random nature of the size and placement. When painting foliage, it's best to start with a bottom-to-top approach. This simply means, instead of trying to paint everything at once, or starting with large objects such as trees or rocks, start with the shortest object, such as grass and ground covering. Then work your way up to larger objects such as bushes, ferns, rocks, boulders, and trees. Don't feel as though you have to fill in every single space on the ground with grass or foliage. Painting your terrain with a grass material opposed to a dirt one is a great way to trick players into thinking there is more foliage in the scene than there actually is. When placing foliage, it's important to be aware of your foliage scale in comparison to the players and other items and structures in your scene. When adding foliage on a terrain with no buildings, structures, or props, it's all too easy to underestimate or overestimate the player size. Placing a player's spawn or a character device in your scene, even if you have no intention on using them, is a great way to get a visual point of reference for your player size. Try to use unique or distinct foliage sparingly. Despite varying size and scale, it can feel repetitive and lose its uniqueness if used too much. Another thing that's important to be aware of and keep track of is how many instances you've created. You can do this by looking at the number count in the foliage panel. A key reason for this is, while foliage instances may not have a dramatic effect on your map's memory size doesn't reflect a player FPS. Additionally, depending on the polygon count of the original static mesh, too many instances of a mid to high poly foliage asset can have a large effect on your project's memory and an even larger effect on your player FPS. Ideally, you want to have more than one grass foliage and texture set. For example, in the custom sample assets we provided in the link in the About You section of the video, there's a short and tall grass, as well as a different texture set for each. Using only one grass foliage asset results in a very artificial-looking environment, since in nature grass isn't an even height unless freshly cut. Additionally, in our experience, it's best to load objects in the foliage list as you need them. This makes managing your foliage assets and settings much easier, since finding and enabling or disabling the foliage asset you need is easier the smaller the list is. enabling uniform scale in the painting drop-down setting, and slightly varying a foliage asset's min and max size is a great way to achieve an extra level of variety and realism when painting foliage. A good way to determine what to set as the max scale value is to drag the base static mesh of the foliage asset into your scene. Then, while using a scale reference for the player, props, or structures, scale the static mesh up, then note and use the value just before the object appears too big. For more lush fields or forests, instead of increasing the density in the foliage paint settings, increase the size of the assets in the asset size offset. This will give the illusion of increased density without increasing the total number of instantiated foliage assets. It's often good to add a small number of more recognizable scenery elements to a level, be it trees, buildings, or some other structure. This helps the player locate themselves and gain a better understanding of the environment they are playing in. Additionally, different kinds of plants and trees can indicate to the player the kind of location they are in. For example, bamboo trees are common in Asia and South America, thus identifying the setting of the map. Had we used palm or banana trees, the player would feel as though they're in the tropics. Had we used multicolored trees with neon leaves, the player may feel as though they are on another planet. For grass and ground foliage, if possible, place as little as possible outside the play area. This can not only save on memory, but also improve performance. Ideally, if the main or key elements of your ground are static meshes, not simply landscape terrain, you want to add your environment props after painting your foliage. This will ensure that you're not inadvertently painting foliage onto your props. However, in circumstances where you do have or need to place environmental elements already in the scene before painting foliage, like in our scene, grouping the objects together then moving the objects under or outside of your painting area is a fast way to paint the terrain and not needlessly spend your time painting around smaller objects. For trees, it's best to have at least two kinds of trees. One to be viewed close up and another to mainly be viewed from a distance. Additionally, if you do want some trees to be destructible, in order for the player to gather resources or simply for aesthetics, you'll need to hand place those trees in the environment. One of the keys to natural-looking foliage is plan variation. In other words, if you were to just add all your foliage assets to one brush and paint across a level, it wouldn't look right. So try to add specific plants to certain areas. Think about how in nature, an area that does not receive a lot of light or water won't usually have thriving plant life, while an area with an abundance of light and water would have thriving fauna. You can also use and paint the foliage in a way that it guides the player. Players will instantly be drawn to areas that have little to no foliage when previous areas had an abundance of it, and vice versa. Don't simply rely on foliage, the landscape tool, or different materials to vary the look of your terrain. Props such as large rocks, ground mesh props, and lakes can be used in great effect to vary the look and feel of your landscape. For example, in this scene there is no landscape. Instead, we created and used static meshes as the terrain. By using a handful of static meshes and the same textures and materials throughout, we're able to create much more varied terrain and materials than we could with the landscape tools. Increasing the min and max scale, located in the painting setting in foliage mode, is a great way to save on resources when placing background foliage assets or foliage assets that's outside the play area. It also gives the illusion to players that the map is much larger than it actually is. Another good optimization technique, after you've initially painted your foliage, is selecting the reapply brush and slightly lowering the density for ground elements such as grass, flowers, ferns, rocks, and small bushes. If done correctly, the reduction in foliage won't be visibly noticeable to the player, but will decrease your map's memory size as well as boost performance. When using imported assets, project memory isn't the only thing you'll need to manage. You'll also need to manage your project size. you can find your project size percent at the top center of your viewport. However, to get a more detailed view, double-click the Project Size button, or under the Tools drop-down, click Project Size to open the Detailed Project Size panel. Additionally, you can also use the Memory Log to manage your game's memory and see how much memory each object in your game is using. In a later video, we'll go into further detail about the Project Size window and Memory Log, as well as how to use it to optimize and manage the size of your project in memory. If during playtesting or gameplay, you notice an area that you've placed foliage, but the foliage doesn't appear in-game, despite being visible in the editor, this is most likely due to a Fortnite Assets Blueprint setting. Within Blueprint, there's a setting called Destroy Foliage when placed. If enabled, it will remove any foliage under or around the object. Lastly, be sure to check your collision settings in the Foliage Assets Instance Settings drop-down and enable Fortnite Building Mesh Physics for large foliage assets such as trees, large rocks, and/or bushes. Even if your static mesh has a collider, if the collision isn't set in your foliage instance settings, your mesh won't have collision. Alright, together we've planted the seeds and watched them bloom. The Crimson Shrine of Suijin stands transformed, a verdant terrain awaiting to be conquered, but this is just the prologue to your epic story. Upcoming chapters unlock realms uncharted, sculpting landscapes that rise and fall like tectonic dreams, designing stealth games where shadows become weapons, and crafting custom assets that defy the boundaries of Fortnite itself. So, are you ready to push the limits of UEFN? To unlock this epic map-making toolkit, hit that subscribe button and smash the notification bell to be the first to see the next steps. Share your thoughts, questions, and maps in the comments below. We're always listening. Let's build epic Fortnite maps together. So always remember, don't just play, create.